Hello everyone, and welcome to the 177th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring El Indio from A Few Dollars More. Well, I've already covered my favorite film of all time, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and considering that it's the third film in the Dollars trilogy, and I covered it first, I figured it would be best if I worked backwards when covering the other two films. Now, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly might be my favorite film of all time, and thus my favorite film in the trilogy, but El Indio might just be my favorite villain out of all three films, with Tuco coming up as a close second, of course. And the reason for that is because he's perhaps the most fascinating old western villain out there, a man who's as diabolical as they come, but one that manages to express a strange sadness and melancholic longing that belies the horror of his actions. So in this video, we're going to explore all the little details that have made El Indio into the villainous icon that he is, picking apart all the details his character is laden with, so we might better understand the cruel and rueful mind of the dreaded El Indio. But before we begin, let's first talk about our sponsor for this video, Raycon. Mother's Day is coming up fast, and it's about time that all of us who celebrate getting gear and find our moms a gift they'll enjoy. Mine loves to listen to audiobooks, but she's still sporting the wired pair of earphones she picked up at some grocery store for $20 years ago. I get it, if it's not broken, don't fix it. But if you can make it better, then maybe you should, and Raycon can definitely do that in this case. Their everyday earbuds are still some of the best you can find on the market, and with noise isolation, 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life, and sweat and water resistance, these earbuds are equipped to handle nearly anything you throw at them. I use mine when I'm working out or listening to the many materials that I need to review for these videos while I'm doing things around the house, and they're so comfortable that it's easy for me to forget they're even there a lot of the time. And considering my mom typically does much the same thing with her audiobooks, I think she'll grow to appreciate her pair just as much as I do mine. But one of the best things about Raycon has to be the price, and you can't get a better bang for your buck when it comes to earbuds. And to make that even more true, Raycon is offering 20% off of all their products just in time for Mother's Day. So click the link down below, or go to buyraycon.com/TVE and get that 20% off your order, as well as free shipping, and get a gift your mom will love by getting an incredible deal on her favorite new earbuds. That's buyraycon.com/TVE to get free shipping and 20% off your purchase. Thank you, Raycon, for sponsoring this video. Now without further ado, let's begin. El Indio appears to us as one might expect a bandit of his era to, with soiled and tattered clothing, questionable hygiene, a disheveled mop of salt and pepper hair, and a closely cropped beard. But the one standout feature of El Indio has to be his eyes. It's often said that a person's eyes never lie, and the truth of El Indio's eyes conveys nothing less than a dire intensity and insanity. Now on the whole, El Indio is as ruthless a bandit as they come, one that revels in the misery of others and his chosen trade. But there is a conflict within El Indio that was born from one fateful night that pushed his insanity further over the edge. Some years ago, when El Indio had nary a gray hair on his head, he met a woman so beautiful that she instantly captured his heart, a feeling that a young Indio may have never experienced until the very moment he laid eyes on her. Any other man may have decided to approach a woman that captivates them and strike up a conversation with her, but for a man so thoroughly ingrained in a life of villainy, El Indio had other plans. Likely following her home after meeting her, Indio proceeds to spy on her through her window, and in this moment, there are a few possibilities we have to consider. One is that Indio planned to just catch another glimpse of her, and depending on his intentions, he could have been doing so just to get another look at her, or he could have been acting as the perverse peeping Tom, attempting to get a more indecent view of his newfound love. It's also possible that Indio was going to play the dashing rogue here, opening her window in the midst of a stormy night, and singing his song of love to her in the hopes of winning her heart. Or, Indio planned to break into her home and assault her. Now considering what kind of man Indio is, the latter option seems to be the most plausible. However, what actually happens here is what makes the other options both tender and not so tender possible. When Indio arrives at her window, he unfortunately finds that this woman is already spoken for, and he proceeds to watch a scene unfold wherein her husband is presenting her with a gift of two lockets, one that presumably held his picture, and the other hers. Now instead of storming in from the get-go and taking what his heart most desires, Indio chooses to sit back and watch this scene unfold for a time with a curious intensity. And here I believe that the reason he does so is because a war is waging within the heart and mind of Indio unlike any other he had experienced before, a swirl of emotions fighting for supremacy within him as the songs of these watches served as a theme for his torment. "What do I do now?" he's saying to himself as the apple of his eye is sharing a tender moment with her beloved. "My heart is breaking. Do I leave? Do I jump down and declare my undying love for her in an attempt to sway her heart away from this cretin? Or do I give in to the rage building within me and take her by force?" Well, as much as any of these options were a possibility, for El Indio, a terror of a man who's likely known violence and strife since he was very young, the latter option was sadly the one that was always destined to win out in the end. And when the music stopped, the horror began. And so Indio descended from the balcony and murdered this woman's husband in cold blood, afterwards violating her in one of the most horrific ways a man can, and with her dead husband lying on the ground next to this now desecrated altar of love no less. But then something occurred that no one watching the situation could have predicted, not even Indio himself. With her husband lying dead on the floor, and her future now likely dominated by a man that has chosen to take her as his own by force, this woman chooses to take up Indio's gun and end her own life. Now, within the span of what we can assume to be a few hours, Indio has experienced several tumultuous things that his already twisted mind was wholly unprepared to experience. Infatuation, heartbreak, love-fueled rage, a brutal triumph, and an even more bitter heartbreak as his newfound love was wrenched from him by her own hand. And though Indio was already likely brutally insane before these things occurred, all these things only drove him ever more mad. For now and forever, there would be a war in the mind of El Indio, a war between sanity and insanity, between a conscience and his lack of it, between sorrow and anguish, and between guilt and remorselessness. Because though Indio chose to take this action, and though such a spur-of-the-moment love is often irrational, as it is in this case, Indio in his own twisted way truly loved this woman, or at least believed he did. And I'm sure in his deranged mind, he even believed that murdering this woman's husband, and then conquering her, would somehow lead to her heart being his. Indio had likely never experienced these feelings before, and upon feeling them for the first time, he reasoned that they could only mean one thing: love. And such a love, no matter how ludicrous it might be, is something that has a significant impact on one's person, especially when that love is as swift in its beginning and its end as it was for Indio. But it had even more of an effect on El Indio than it might have had on any other. As for a man who may have never felt love from or for anyone prior to this moment, running through all these things at once left him reeling from the loss of the one true love he had ever had. And just as 1,000 questions ran through Indio's mind when he came to her window, in the wake of his love's death, his mind raced from one lamentation to the next. But there was one louder than all the others that would stick with him for the rest of his life. How could I do such a horrid thing to a woman I loved? And what kind of man am I? Up until this moment, Indio had been content to be the merciless bandit, a man who took what he wanted and killed who he wanted to when he wanted to, and cared not who he was taking it from, or who he was killing. But now Indio had all the heartbreak he'd experienced and the image of his dead love permanently burned into his memory, and whenever he was alone with his thoughts, his mind would inevitably wander towards the horror of that night, which was made ever more persistent by the sound of the musical watch he chose to take as a memento to remember his love by, the melody with which he would use to great effect in his insidious endeavors from here on out, using it as a ticking omen that portended the onset of his brutality once its tune had ended, just as it had when he had murdered his love's husband. But the horrid memories that accompanied this tune were too much for Indio to bear, for when the music stops and the dust settles, El Indio is left only with the wretched creature that is himself, and the pain that accompanies such clarity. And so to quell the ache that permeated every fiber of his being, he turned to his mysterious drug of choice so he could stop the pain, entering a stupor that calmed his mind and erased the terror of what he's done and what he's become, for a time at least. For the remainder of his life, El Indio would be haunted by melancholy and sorrow that often manifested in his forlorn gaze. His eyes glazed over as a distorted rendition of the watch's song plays over the devilish imagery running through his mind that he alone had created. And if Indio was mad with brutality and cruelty before, that madness was now accompanied and amplified by torment and a mournful longing, which is reflected in the darkness that now encircles eyes that already projected so much dire insanity prior to this dreaded act. Now this is obviously quite distressing for poor Indio, and it drove him madder than he already was, but to what effect we can actually use the term poor Indio is dubious. As though Indio has forced himself to suffer through his actions, his suffering isn't even close to being a just punishment for the assault and murder of a woman and her husband, and it's only fitting that he should at least suffer in this way in the absence of a more apt punishment for his crimes. And indeed, El Indio deserves much punishment for who he is and what he's done. Never mind the fact that he had in all likelihood been a brutal criminal prior to this sordid affair. We have plenty to look to in this story alone that shows us what kind of wretched beast El Indio is. When we first meet Indio during his breakout, we find ourselves faced with a man who's eager to murder his cellmate, who we later learn was a carpenter who turned him onto a bit of key information that would lead Indio to forming a plot, that being the robbery of the El Paso bank. El Indio proceeds to order and participate in the murder of every guard and jailer at the prison, save only one, who he chooses to torment by firing a blank in his face before declaring that the only reason he lives is so he can spread the tale that Indio, the terror of the West, is once again free and roaming the land, ending his proclamation with a diabolical laugh that speaks volumes about the sadistic glee that he experiences when tormenting or murdering others. From here, Indio sets out to punish the man who had betrayed him, riding to a church with his gang and the offender as well as his wife and infant child in tow. If our introduction to him wasn't enough to tell us that he's a sadist, in this scene, Indio makes it abundantly clear what kind of abhorrent man he is, and he proceeds to berate this man for having sold him out, telling him that it would have been better for him, as well as his family, if he had killed him when he could have. Why, you ask? Because shortly after, Indio orders his men to take this man's wife and son outside to be murdered, showing us that not even the most innocent among us are safe from the cruel hand of El Indio. But to his credit, when it comes time for Indio to do battle against another man, he makes sure to give him a fair chance at conquering the man who has caused him so much pain. Or does he? When El Indio offers another man a chance to have a showdown with him, he tells them that the signal for their standoff to begin is the ending of his watch's song. Now that seems like a fine enough indicator, but only if you've listened to this song beforehand. Anyone can hear when a song ends, but when a watch slowly counts down the end of a melody, and you've never heard it, the man who has the advantage of knowing the exact moment when said song is going to end inevitably has the upper hand, and he is thus able to get the better of his opponent via this knowledge. So even when El Indio appears to be acting in an honorable way, in reality, he decidedly isn't, and that becomes quite apparent as his plot to rob the El Paso bank unfolds. El Indio is clearly quite intelligent despite his barbarity, and though he was tipped off by his former cellmate about the bank's hidden safe, a man who leads a band of men has to have a forward-thinking mind, a good amount of charisma, or brutal confidence to inspire such allegiance, and such is the case with El Indio. In his plan to rob the bank, Indio factors in a diversion in the nearby town of Santa Rosa to direct the attentions of the authorities there, whilst he and his gang blow a hole in the El Paso bank and make off with the loot, making sure to destroy the telegram wires while they're en route to their destination to further the success of his plot, which is a pretty sound plan for robbing a bank that's considered one of the most formidable in the land. What throws a wrench in the idea that El Indio is this mastermind of criminal proportions is the fact that our dual protagonists, the bounty hunters Monco and Colonel Mortimer, are able to successfully infiltrate his gang by having Monco rescue one of Indio's jailed gang members and offering his release as a notion of his good intentions when asking to sign up for his gang. Also, Monco and Mortimer can successfully apprehend the gang and claim their bounties later on. However, after the robbery is concluded and the gang has holed themselves up in the town of Agua Caliente, Monco and Mortimer attempt to make off with the loot so they might claim the new bounty of $40,000 that the bank has issued in return for the reattainment of their lost funds. Monco and Mortimer are caught in the act here, but not because they weren't being stealthy about it, but because Indio knew from the moment Monco signed up for his gang that he was a bounty hunter, and when he encountered Mortimer in Agua Caliente and he murdered one of his associates and agreed to help them open their safe, he knew that he was also a bounty hunter. So this shows us that not only is Indio intelligent enough to run a gang and formulate complex plans, but he's also cunning, observant, and cautious, a man who isn't easily fooled, that's made it as far as he has in life in such a volatile profession, because underneath his insanity lies a complex mind that's unfortunately been ravaged by everything he's experienced, and even more so, by everything that he's done. So what does El Indio do when he finally ousts the subversive elements in his midst? Why, he subjects them to a brutal beating at the hands of his gang members, of course, all the while laughing maniacally as these men are beaten within an inch of their lives, thereafter imprisoning them so they might suffer more of the wounds they've just received. Now, most men in Indio's position probably would have executed this duo after subjecting them to torture, as leaving such dangerous men alive leaves too many unwanted possibilities should they escape. But this is where El Indio shows himself to be a man who doesn't even hold the bonds of friendship he develops with his fellow man in high regard, for El Indio kept these men alive for one particular reason, so they could assist him in fulfilling yet another scheme. El Indio has his seemingly most valued associate, Nino, take the knife of another of his men, Cuchillo, and has him murder yet another one of his friends, Slim, after which he goes and releases both Monco and Mortimer, gifting them with empty pistols before sending them on their way. Indio later reveals that his reasons for ordering this chain of events was so he could manufacture a battle between the rest of his gang and Monco and Mortimer, so these expert gunmen might pick them all off one by one, which would then make it so the loot they acquired at the bank would only be shared by two, Nino and himself, rather than the entire group. While this obviously gives El Indio a bigger payday, it also adds another layer of safety to the journey he has to embark on with said loot, as two men traveling together is much less noticeable than an entire gang trudging across the desert, a gang that the authorities and every bounty hunter in a 200-mile radius will undoubtedly be searching for. So to make this plot believable, he frames Cuchillo for the murder of Slim, putting on some convincing crocodile tears to his men once he's murdered Cuchillo, sending them afterwards to die at the hands of these two bounty hunters so he can escape with his most trusted friend. But considering all that we know about El Indio, was Nino truly a friend he wished to run away with, or just another patsy in his never-ending string of schemes? Probably the latter, as a man traveling alone with a considerable sum of money in his saddlebags is bound to run into trouble on these lonesome western roads, and so enlisting the aid of a so-called friend willing to carry some of the burden and watch his back was nothing more than another tool that Indio would eventually discard with as little mercy as he showed to any other. That might not be too heartbreaking when you consider that the members of Indio's gang were likely just as guilty as he was in committing numerous atrocities, but it still speaks volumes about the kind of cruel and unforgiving man that El Indio was. But whether they fell to Indio's own hand, or to the hand of another that opposed him, they were all far more likely to enter an early grave than they were to ride off into the sunset. And such is even the case for El Indio himself, for all his cunning and brutality could not help him escape the ghosts of his past, and with a mournful tear falling from his eye, El Indio met his ultimate end at the hands of the brother of the woman who haunted him until the day he died. And at this end, who was El Indio? He was a man who was born into a world of hardship and violence, who became the living embodiment of all the dreaded aspects of the many men who have lived and died with a gun in their hand. A man who became a terror who was feared by all who knew his name, as a madman who brook no quarter and ended even the most innocent of lives if it suited his needs. But El Indio was a man like any other, and upon being struck by the magnificent feeling that comes with sudden onset infatuation, he became a man who in short order experienced immense love, heartbreak, anger, guilt, and self-resentment as he caused the untimely death of a woman who he had loved fiercely and unjustly. But who knows how many innocents fell to the hand of El Indio and the members of his gang, for the tragedy of his actions did not just end in this bedroom, but continued on every day that he drew breath. In this final robbery, perhaps he thought with the money he took that he could run far away and finally find some peace, escaping the madness of his watch that tormented him day after day. But for a man who had so completely given himself to evil, an unhappy end was always waiting for him. And for this cruel sadist, who was tormented endlessly by everything that he had become, it was only fitting that he should be consumed by the darkness that he had created. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on El Indio? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.